Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Commander Adventures. This week is a bit of a long game, which features many big plays and lots of removal. First off, we have Devin giving Danny's Teysa Orzhov Scion deck a whirl. We then have Garrett looking for a good time with Rakdos, Lord of Riots. We then have Ben giving Omnath Locus of the Royal its first try. And finally we have Danny pulling out a classic partnership in Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker, and Thrasios Triton Hero. Let's jump in. Devin starts us off. He drops the plains for turn, and then uses it to cast a Skull Clamp. Garrett drops a tapped Acuum Refuge, and gains 1 life. Ben drops a Flamekin Village, and chooses not to reveal an elemental. Danny drops a tapped Prairie Street. Devin untaps, and then drops a Swamp for turn. He then taps out to cast a Blood Artist. Garrett drops a tapped Lava Claw Reaches, and passes. Ben drops a Forest. Danny drops a Sunpetal Grove, and then taps 2 to cast Thrasios. Devin untaps, and then drops a Swamp for turn. He pays 1 to equip his Blood Artist with Skull Clamp, and drains Ben for a life, and draws 2 as it dies. He then taps his remaining mana to cast a Suture Priest. Garrett untaps. He drops a Graven Cairn for turn, and then taps out to cast a Loyal Subordinate. Ben drops a Forest for turn. Danny untaps, and drops a Reliquary Tower before passing. Devin untaps. He drops a Plains for turn, and then taps 3 to cast a Grim Haruspex. He gains a life as it enters from Suture Priest, and then spends 1 mana to equip the Priest with Skull Clamp. He draws a total of 3 this time as it dies, and then discards down to 7 at end step. Garrett untaps, and then drops a Swamp for turn. He moves to combat, and swings Loyal Subordinate at Ben for 3 damage. In his main 2, he then moves to cast his commander Rakdos. In response, Danny casts an Arcane Denial. Garrett lets Rakdos go to the graveyard, and then passes turn. On Ben's upkeep, Garrett draws 2, and Danny draws 1 from Arcane Denial. Ben then drops a Flooded Strand for turn, and cracks it, going to shock in a Breeding Pool. He then taps 4, and casts his commander Omnath, Locus of the Royal. He pings Loyal Subordinates with the ETB trigger, and kills it. Danny untaps. He drops a Forest for turn, and then taps out to cast a Tamiyo Field Researcher. He upticks her, targeting both Thrasios and Omnath. He then moves to combat, and hits Garrett for 1 commander damage. He draws off of Tamiyo's trigger, and then passes. Devin untaps. He drops a Swamp for turn, and then taps 4 to cast a Solemn Simulacrum. He brings the Plains into play tapped, and then spends his remaining mana to equip the Haruspex with Skull Clamp. He then moves to combat, and hits Tamiyo for 4 with Grim Haruspex. Garrett untaps, and then drops a Tainted Peak for turn. He casts an Anger, and then kills Tamiyo in combat. Ben untaps. Misunderstanding how Tamiyo's trigger works, he moves to combat and swings Omnath at Danny, thinking he'll draw a card. In reality, when Tamiyo triggers, Danny draws a card. Ben then moves to his main 2, and casts a Crucible of Worlds. He replays Flooded Strand for turn, and triggers Omnath for a +1/+1 counter. He then cracks the Strand, and brings an island in untapped, once again triggering Omnath. Danny untaps. He shocks in a Hallowed Fountain for turn, and then casts his second commander Ishai, Ojutai Dragonspeaker. With his 1 remaining mana, he casts a Mystic Remora. Devin untaps. He drops a Vault of the Archangel for turn, and then taps 5 to cast an Endrixar Master Breeder. Devin then spends his remaining mana, casting a Diabolic Intent. He sacrifices Solemn Simulacrum as part of the cost, and Danny draws off of Mystic Remora, and puts a counter on Ishai. Devin then draws 2, and passes turn while searching his library. Garrett untaps, and drops a Terramorphic Expanse for turn. He then casts a Rain of Gore, and gives Danny a counter on Ishai, and a draw from Mystic Remora. He follows up with a Sulfuric Vortex, and Danny does the same again. He then cracks a Terramorphic Expanse to go and grab a mountain, and passes while searching. Ben loses 2 life on his upkeep to Sulfuric Vortex, and then taps 3 to cast a Hedonist Climb. This adds another counter to Ishai, and Danny gets another draw from Mystic Remora. Ben then drops a Fiery Islet, and triggers Omnath. As he moves to combat, Hedonist Climb puts another counter onto Omnath, and then flips into the Winged Temple of Orzhika. Before declaring attacks, he spends 3 mana and loses 1 life to Fiery Islet to activate Orzhika, targeting Omnath. This makes Omnath a 14/14, which Ben swings at Danny in an attempt to kill Ishai. Danny does block, and Ishai returns to the command zone. Danny chooses not to pay for Mystic Remora on his upkeep, and then takes 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex. He casts a Ponder, and deciding he doesn't like what he sees on top, elects to shuffle his library before drawing a card. He then taps his remaining mana to cast a Seedborn Muse. Danny untaps alongside Devin, and then Devin takes 2 in his upkeep. Devin plays a Plains, and then uses it to cast a Soul Ring. He then casts an Anguished Unmaking, targeting Seedborn Muse. In response, Danny disallows the Anguished Unmaking to keep his Seedborn Muse alive. After that, Devin casts a Revelark. He gains 5 1/1 Thralls from Endrixar's trigger, and uses a face-down sleeve instead of the Thrall token. Moving to combat, he hits Danny for 4 damage with Grim Haruspex. Danny untaps alongside Garrett, and then Garrett takes 2 in his upkeep. Deciding people are tapping a little too much mana for his liking, Garrett casts a Mana Barbs. Before it resolves, Danny activates Thrasios to look for an answer. Finding none, he scries a card to the bottom, and reveals a Council's Judgment, which he takes to hand. Mana Barbs then resolves, and Garrett passes to Ben. Once again, Danny untaps alongside Ben, and Ben takes 2 on his upkeep from Sulfuric Vortex. Ben replays Flooded Strand, and triggers Omnath, adding a +1/+1 counter, and drawing from the second half of the trigger since he now has 8 lands. He then cracks the Strand, and loses a life to go and grab an island. As it enters, it triggers Omnath again, and then he taps it, and takes the damage from Mana Barbs to cast a Soul Ring. He then takes an additional 3 from Mana Barbs to double Omnath's power and toughness with Orzhika. In combat, he swings 18 commander damage at Garrett. In his second main phase, he loses a total of 4 more life to cast a Teamer Charm. He chooses to have Omnath fight Seedborn Muse, and in response, Danny takes 4 from Mana Barbs to activate Thrasios. Danny doesn't find an answer, but does reveal a Mirari's Wake after scrying a card away. Seedborn Muse then gets pummeled by Omnath, and Ben passes turn. Danny takes a total of 6 damage in his main phase to cast a Bane of Progress. As it enters, it destroys all artifacts and enchantments, and puts 7 +1/+1 counters on itself. Garrett then reminds him of the 2 damage from Sulfuric Vortex. Danny then follows up with an Authority of the Consuls. Devin untaps, Devin casts a Liliana Dreadhorde General. He downticks Liliana, and forces everyone to sacrifice 2 creatures. As he sacrifices 2 Thralls, he draws cards from Liliana, and then casts a Nim Deathmantle. He finally moves to combat, and swings 8 at Danny. Garrett untaps. He casts an Endbringer, which enters hasted, but tapped due to Authority of the Consuls, and Danny gains a life. Garrett untaps his Endbringer during Ben's untap, and then Ben loses a life to cast a hasted but tapped Maelstrom Wanderer, and Danny gains a life. As he cascades, Ben hits a Grove Rumbler, and a Soul of the Harvest, which both enter hasted and tapped, and gain Danny 2 more life. Ben then drops a Forest for turn, and as he moves to end step, Garrett pings a Thrall for 1. Devin goes to draw 2 cards, and Danny reminds him that Grim Haruspex only draws off of non-tokens. Danny drops an island for turn. He then casts a Council's Judgment. In response, Garrett pings a Thrall, and Devin gets a draw from Liliana. Danny suggests they intentionally tie the vote to get rid of both Liliana and Maelstrom. This happens, and both permanents are exiled. Danny then casts a Supreme Verdict to destroy all creatures. Devin stacks his triggers so he draws 2 cards with Grim Haruspex, and then returns both Blood Artist and Suture Priest with Revelark. Both entered tapped, and Danny gains 2 life, while Devin gains 1 from Suture Priest. With the board mostly reset, Danny passes off. Devin drops the Swamp, and then spends 1 to cycle a Baron more. He casts Teysa for the first time this game, once again triggering Authority, and then follows up with an Ashnod's Altar. Garrett untaps, and then drops a Rogue's Passage. He then puts out a Burnished Heart, triggers Authority, and passes turn. Ben loses a life to Fiery Islet, and drops a Nissa Vital Force. He downticks her, and returns his Soul Ring to hand from his graveyard. He then taps an island to recast Soul Ring, and passes. On Danny's untap, Ben realizes Orzika taps for any mana, and that he could have cast his commander. Danny then drops a Port Town tapped. He casts a Mirari's Wake, and then passes off to Devin. Devin drops a Swamp for turn, and then moves to cast a Darkest Hour. Danny realizes that Devin just wins if this resolves, and proceeds to dismiss it. With Darkest Hour countered, Devin casts a Mortify targeting Mirari's Wake. Mirari's Wake is destroyed, and Devin moves to combat, killing Nissa and hitting Danny for 1. After combat, Devin mistakes how Nim Deathmantle works, and pays to equip the Teysa. At end step, Garrett cracks his Burnished Heart. In response, Danny casts an Enlightened Tutor, Garrett resolves his Burnished Heart, bringing in a Swamp, and a Mountain tapped. Garrett untaps. As he moves to his turn, Danny reveals Cataclysmic Gearhulk from Enlightened Tutor. Garrett then casts a Meteor Golem, targeting Authority of the Councils with its ETB. Danny gains life. Garrett then delves away 8 cards, and taps a Swamp to cast Sibseg Muckdraggers. He returns Rakdos to hand with its ETB, and then passes turn. Ben untaps. He casts a Temur Ascendancy, and then loses 1 to Fiery Islet to recast Omnath. Omnath's ETB kills the Blood Artist, and Devin targets Ben with its trigger, and gains a life from the Spirit entering. Danny drops a Plains for turn, and then casts a Cultivate. He puts a Forest on the battlefield tapped, and takes an island to hand. He then recasts Thrasios, and casts a Mu Yanling Skydancer. He upticks her targeting the Spirit, and then passes turn. Devin untaps, and then drops a Swamp for turn. He casts a Viscera Seer, and as Ben returns to the table, Devin resolves a Grave Pact. Devin then moves to combat and swings Teysa at Mu Yanling. Danny recognizes he's just going to lose Thrasios as soon as Devin sacrifices a creature, so he blocks with it. Devin sacrifices Teysa to Ashnod's altar. He resolves his triggers, causing each of his opponents to sacrifice a creature. And then pays 4 to return Teysa with Nim Deathmantle. He then passes turn. Garrett untaps. He drops Stigma Lasher, which is a perfect card for his Rakdos. He then follows up with Harsh Mentor, and swings at Devin for 2, activating Rogue's Passage to make it unblockable. Devin responds to Declaration of Attackers by sacrificing his Spirit to Viscera Seer. This triggers Harsh Mentor and Grave Pact, and also gives Devin a Scry. He then chooses to take the 2 damage from Stigma Lasher, and can no longer gain life for the rest of the game. Ben drops a Chandra Awakened Inferno, and upticks her, giving each of his opponents an emblem with at the beginning of your upkeep this emblem deals 1 damage to you, and proving why she's quickly becoming a commander powerhouse. He then drops an untapped Hinterland Harbor, and passes turn. Danny takes the damage on his upkeep from the emblem, and then drops an island. He upticks Mu Yanling, targeting Teysa. He then follows up with a Cataclysmic Gearhulk. With the Cataclysmic Gearhulk on the stack, Devin then sacrifices Suture Priest and a Viscera Seer, loses 2 life from Harsh Mentor, and scries a card to bottom of the library. Grave Pact then resolves and causes each of his opponents to sacrifice a creature. He then does the same with Teysa, and puts another card on bottom. Cataclysmic Gearhulk then resolves, and each opponent chooses 1 of each non-land permanent type and sacrifices the rest. Danny then follows up with a Batterskull and moves to end step. As he does, Devin sacrifices Viscera Seer to itself, gaining a scry, and triggering Grave Pact to remove the Germ token. Devin untaps, and then takes a damage on his upkeep. He recasts Teysa from the command zone, and passes turn. Garrett loses 1 on his upkeep, and then drops a mountain. He casts Pyrohemia, and activates it, dealing 1 damage to each creature and each player. Now that the casting restriction is gone from Rakdos, he casts him from hand. He then moves to combat and hits Chandra for 6 damage. On end step, Ben sacrifices Fiery Islet to draw a card. Ben moves to his turn, and starts off by upticking Chandra again, giving each opponent an additional emblem. He then casts an Omnath Locus of Rage, and moves to draw a card from Temur Ascendancy. With the draw trigger on the stack, Devin sacrifices Teysa to Ashnod's altar, forcing everyone to sacrifice a creature. Ben misses the trigger from Omnath's death in the confusion, and then plays a mountain from hand. He then ends his turn by casting a Creeping Trailblazer. Danny untaps, and then takes 2 on his upkeep from the emblems. He upticks Mu Yanling, targeting Creeping Trailblazer. He then recasts Thrasios, and cast a Phantasmal Image as a copy of Trailblazer in an attempt to keep enough creatures on board to survive through Grave Pact. Devin attempts to cast Hero's Downfall targeting Chandra. However, Ben is ready with Heroic Intervention. Devin untaps, and then takes 2 on his upkeep. With nothing else to do, he passes. At end step, Danny activates Thrasios and reveals a Sigarda Host of Herons. Garrett takes 2 on his upkeep, and then deals 3 damage to each person and creature with Pyrohemia. In the confusion, everyone misses that the Batterskull is not currently a creature, so Pyrohemia stays on board. He then recasts Rakdos, and uses the cost reduction to cheat in Void Winnower and a Palladium Mirror. He moves to combat, and decides the easiest way to get rid of Chandra is to kill Ben. The rest of his creatures go at Devin for 8 damage. And then Garrett passes to Danny. Danny takes 2 on his upkeep. And then casts a Sigarda Host of Herons for turn. He ultimates Mu Yanling, and now he can choose to tap his islands to draw a card. He then equips Sigarda with Batterskull, and passes turn. Devin drops a Plains, and then remembers the 2 damage on his upkeep from the Chandra emblems. He casts a Fiend Hunter, and targets Void Winnower with its ETB. With the Exile trigger still on the stack, he flashes in a Dictate of Erebos. With the ability still on the stack, he sacrifices the Fiend Hunter to Ashnod's Altar. Both Dictate and Grave Pact resolve, causing everyone who can to sacrifice 2 creatures, and Garrett mistakenly sacrifices the rest of his board, and allows Void Winnower to go into permanent exile with Fiend Hunter. Devin then decides to deal with Sigarda by casting a Damnation. Danny responds with Damnation on the stack, and taps 2 islands to draw 2 cards. And as they go to resolve Damnation, Garrett realizes he's going to lose Pyrohemia, so he activates it to deal a damage to everyone. Devin then passes turn. Garrett loses 2 on his upkeep, and is stuck in top deck mode. He casts a Quest for Pure Flame, and passes. At his end step, Danny taps an island to draw a card. Danny drops a Temple of Abundance for turn, scrying a card to the bottom. And loses 2 on his upkeep. He then casts Ranger's Path.
He brings in a Temple Garden and a Breeding Pool tapped.
He then drops a Stoneforge Mystic, and uses its ETB to grab a Blackblade Reforged. Devin takes 2 on his upkeep. And then casts a Teysa Karlov. He then breaks the laws of reality a little bit, and puts another younger Teysa onto the board from his command zone. Garrett takes 2 on his upkeep. He hits a Foreboding Ruins, and plays it for turn. As he moves to end step, Danny taps 4 islands to draw 4. Danny takes 2 on his upkeep from the emblems, and then taps 3 islands to draw 3 more. He then casts a Clever Impersonator. With the Impersonator on the stack, Devin sacrifices Teysa Karlov to Ashnod's, clearing the creatures from the board, and gaining 2 spirits. Clever Impersonator then hits, and becomes a copy of Grave Pact. Danny then follows up with a Birds of Paradise, and then recast Ishai. Devin takes 2 on his upkeep. He then casts a Seraph of the Scales for turn. Garrett takes 2 on his upkeep, and then animates Lava Claw Reaches. He activates Rogue's Passage to make it unblockable, and attacks Danny for 2. He puts a counter on Quest for Pure Flame, and passes. Danny moves to his upkeep, and realizing he has nothing left to save himself, dies to the Chandra emblems. Devin loses 2 on his upkeep, and then moves to combat. He swings lethal at Garrett, and wins the game.
Game review.
This was a bit of a slap-down, drag-em-out game, where several players ended up in top deck mode. Garrett's deck worked as intended, consistently damaging his opponents throughout the course of the game. Unfortunately, the plethora of board wipes in the early game stopped him by collateral damage. And then Devin's Grave Pact meant that he was never really able to drop his high-end creatures to close out the game. Ben's Omnath came close to being a lethal threat for a bit, but the second people realized he was in range to one-shot with commander damage, they no longer let him keep his commander on board. Perhaps some sources of Hexproof or Shroud, combined with landfall token producers to allow him to recover more quickly, would have positioned his deck a little bit better. To his credit, it was his Chandra emblems which ultimately put the game on a turn count. I've seen Danny's Ishai deck work with flying colors in the past, but this game it seemed he had all the right cards at all the wrong times. It felt he drew many of his threats early, and much of his ramp late game, pretty much the exact opposite of what you normally want. There's a small chance that if he had politicked a little bit more, and allowed other people to remove threats first, he may have been able to save his answers for later on in the game when he needed them a bit more. Finally, that brings us to Devin. From the beginning, Devin's deck was in a favorable matchup. It runs an almost obscene amount of answers to creatures, and since most of the table's decks were dependent on one or two big creatures, resolving spells like Grave Pact and Dictate of Erebos shut them out of most of their threats. Even with several misplays and mistriggers, which can mostly be contributed to the fact that it isn't his deck, Devin was more than able to pull away with a win here. As always, I want to thank all the players for being a part of this game. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to Dungeon Games in Fort Myers for allowing us to film. If you're interested in being in one of these videos, feel free to drop by Dungeon Games on Tuesday or Saturday when Devin records. If you've enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to see more of our Commander content. We have some new series lined up in the production phase, and we're excited to roll them out here soon. And as always, thank you for watching.